So the fourth area of security for Azure SQL is security management. And it all starts first with auditing in Azure SQL. Now, first of all, we've talked about the Azure ecosystem and things like RBAC. So you're going to want to monitor Azure level activities outside of Azure SQL. And you can do that with Azure Monitor Logs. You have that capability through Azure Monitor. Now with the Azure Managed Instance, it's going to feel a lot like SQL Server. You're going to have access to the SQL Server audit functionality, just like on SQL Server on-prem, with a few differences. Number one, you're used to storing your Azure SQL audit logs in your private file system or on a network share, but you don't have that with Managed Instance. So you're going to store these logs in Azure Blob Storage. And since we're integrated with the Azure ecosystem, you're going to also be able to store these audit logs with Azure Monitor and even Event Hub for streaming. Now, when you create a SQL audit, you're used to in SQL Server supplying some decisions that if an audit doesn't work, like what do you do? Well, you don't have the shutdown option, but you do have the failure and continue option. So you can fail the operation or you continue if an auditing fails to work during a given sequence. For Azure Database, it's a little bit different. You don't supply the Azure SQL Audit feature, but we use it behind the scenes. So you're going to use something called Azure SQL Auditing, and you're going to do that through the portal or CLIs. And because you're used to things called action groups, we still supply that functionality, but we're going to supply some default ones for server and database audit action groups, kind of like the batch completed groups, an example. And we document what are those default groups that we set up when you do SQL Server audit. Because of the fact that we're fully managed service in Azure SQL Database, you can still use the Azure Storage account and Event Hubs, but you get a little bit more advantage here in that you can store these audits in Azure Log Analytics with a complete dashboard look and feel to get a very visual look and feel of your audits. Now, you're also going to want to know what are the aspects of monitoring and managed security when it comes to audit and other aspects that you would do like in SQL Server. So first of all, you're going to use activity logs and RBAC auditing for that entire Azure monitoring experience. You want to go through and analyze, how do I want to audit which subscriptions and accounts are doing things from an Azure perspective at the Azure level for resources associated with Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. And then second of all, for Managed Instance, you're going to go configure that SQL Server audit feature, and then you're going to decide, like, where do I store that? Now, in SQL Server, in addition, you're used to seeing this capability of tracking failed and successful logins, and that capability still exists. That's outside the capabilities of SQL Server audit. So you still get that because it's a complete SQL Server instance. For Azure Database, you again can configure Azure SQL auditing feature as I described, but you do have some other capabilities that are specific to Azure Database. So for example, there's a DMV called Sys Event Log. In there, you can see and track the number of successful or failed connections or the number of connections that were blocked by a firewall. In addition, because we're connected with the Azure monitoring system, you can see these same type of data through Azure metrics or even through alerts. So you can, for example, set up alerts to see, oh, I saw a bunch of failed connections or people blocked by a firewall in my Azure database. I need to get alerted that that's going on in my environment. Now, we're going to talk about in a bit, as part of security management, the fact you're going to have advanced data security with something called advanced threat protection. So you're going to want to set up alerts for that. And all of that being integrated with something called the Azure Security Center. So you're going to have all those type of capabilities. So we've talked about the fourth category of security, which is security management. We kind of dove in about auditing, which is a very important part of how you do things in Azure and with SQL Server, how you audit the Azure level, audit the SQL Server at the Azure Database level with Managed Instance or with Azure Database. And then we talked about these aspects of how you're going to manage and monitor security. You're going to use auditing or other capabilities to monitor failed successful logins and even metrics and use alerting for that type of capability. So those are some important elements when you think about security management with Azure SQL. See you in the next video.